I have several times now had the privilege to interview Mr. Brian Peckford. The Honorable Brian Peckford served for 10 years as the Premier of Newfoundland, and he is the sole surviving author and signatory of our Charter of Rights and Freedoms. We're both here at the Reclaiming Canada Conference in Victoria, and today I finally have the opportunity to have an in-person conversation with Brian. And that's what we're going to talk about. Not so much about politics, but about Brian himself and his remarkable contributions to our country. Brian, it's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you. Good for us to do an in-person interview for a change.
And it's a real pleasure. I have to do interviews via Zoom all the time, just out of practicality.
Of course.
But I have a vast preference for sitting down with someone I can actually talk to them face to face.
Yes, exactly.
So I want to start with this. 3 years ago, our country went insane. And you have been fighting tirelessly since then to bring people the truth, to launch lawsuits, to work with lawyers. You have been speaking so many times. But you're in your 80s. And a lot of people would say, well, how do you have the energy to do this? But I'm not going to ask you that question because I know the answer to it. I can't remember who it was who said this, but somebody said, anyone who has a sufficient why will find the how. And so the question I'm going to ask you, Brian, is why? Because no one would have blamed you at your age if you had sat in your chair and you let other people fight this war. Because I don't know if there's anybody else I've ever interviewed who's made as much of a contribution to our country as you have.
Thank you. I think at the end of the day, when I think about a question like that it comes down to something that's been part of the person for a long time. The easy answer, I think, that first comes to mind is, well, suddenly we were confronted with a real big problem here as it relates to our Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which I was a part of. And therefore I had to speak up because what I had fought for was others, was in jeopardy, and freedoms of Canadians was in jeopardy. But I think, for me anyway, it goes a lot deeper. I think very early on as a boy, I was always aggravated, I guess, or somehow simulated when something wasn't fair. I remember as a boy, only 7 or 8 years old, getting into a big argument with my fellow kids on the makeshift soccer field because we were selecting teams amongst the kids who turned up. And when we were ready to play, and however many we had on the side, 6 versus 6, or whatever the number was, the other team, put another player on the field. So when we started to play, I noticed right away, they had 7, we had 6. So I stopped the game. I just hollered and stopped the game. And I remember this to this day. And I said, but you're not being fair. You've got 7 on the field and we only have 6. You tricked us. This is not right. And that word fair, however I came about it at that time, it was no other word. It was the word fair. And I can remember that time, like I say, I wasn't 10. And from that day on, sort of thing, when I was in the circumstance where something wasn't fair, it wasn't reasonable to both sides or whatever, I would speak up. And so that happened many, many times, even in my family. If I was sitting down having something to eat and something wasn't fair from one to the other, I would say to my mother, that's not fair because, right, my brother got this and my sister got that, or my other brother got something else. It was 6 of us in the family, 6 children. But so I think the concept of fairness was always there. And when I went to university, through high school too, I remember, for example, we had our lockers were down in the basement of an old school, and you go up the stairs to where the classrooms were. And there was one guy who was more muscular than the rest, and he sort of preyed on everybody else. I was his age. I might have been a year older, but I saw that happen, and where he was physically sort of trying to dominate somebody else who was smaller than him or weaker than him, and I saw that happen 2 or 3 times, and I couldn't take it anymore. So I just had to step in and say, you can't do that. That's unfair. He's a lot smaller than you. You're that's not fair. So he went to push me or something, and before he got a chance really to do anything, I went after him first, and he went down, even though quite likely he was stronger than me. I don't know for how long he would be stronger than me, because I was always one that I had more perseverance than the other side, even though if they were bigger than me or stronger than me. But by taking the advantage, he fell for whatever reason, tripped or whatever. It might have been because I pushed. He went down, which suddenly put him on the disadvantage, and he stopped. And he stopped and moved away. And all the kids said, yay, right. Somebody took on the bully here in the school. That was a physical kind of thing. So, and also, I remember going to school. My father went to University of Toronto for 1 year. And we went to school in a high school in Toronto, which didn't work out very well for me at all. And a number of the teachers were picking on, we were in grade 11, I think. That was when Ontario had grade 13. And this was grade 11, which was weird for me because I just came out of grade 10 in Newfoundland. And some courses were going on to 12 or 11. And others you picked up, you started in 9, picked it up in 12. Started in 11 or 10, and you picked it up in 13. So what I was getting out of this education wasn't going to be sufficient for me to have my matriculation when I went back home. So I had to go back and do a grade 11 in Newfoundland. So it was sort of a wasted year academically in that sense, although I did learn a few things in science that we didn't have at our rural school in Newfoundland. But I spoke up and said to the teacher, I just blurted it out, that's not fair. You're not treating her fair. You kicked me out of the classroom. So I sort of come by it sort of naturally when something is not fair. And then we'll build on that, an education, right, and a system whereby I graduated from high school and then went teaching. And then I got involved in politics. That fairness always stayed with me. And so it was quite natural for me then 3 years ago to build on that history. And then being involved like I was as a first minister, involved in the Constitution. But I think the whole thing stems out of a character and a personality, which was me back when I was a boy.
Now, I have to make a confession. I've been spying on you. I talked to your wife, Carol, yesterday, and I told her that we were going to do this interview, and I was going to ask you about your life. And so she made the suggestion that I should ask you about your relationship with your grandfather, who was a fisherman. He took you out the boats. And of course, your father, who was a social worker.
Yeah.
And I have to think that had to set some patterns for you as a child.
Yes. I never ever met my grandfather. My father he died around the time I was born. My father always used to say the world couldn't take the two of us at the same time. But I learned from my father and my aunts a lot about my grandfather. And from the first time I heard about him, I was really struck by his determination, by his perseverance, by his He's obviously in one of my books. I relate the story of my grandfather out to sea, and they were going in on a. They were going to crash into the rocks, and how he helped save the day. He went to the seal fishery for 49 years. 49 years, and he was on two, I think, different sealing disasters where almost everybody died on the ice, except him and a few. So he was on the Greenland, as a very famous Newfoundland sealing disaster, and he was also on the Florizel, which was another sealing problem issue. He built up his own business as a fisherman and hired people in the summertime that were called shearmen. They shared and they usually looked after these shearmen in the summertime. They came from other places and they were put up. My father and grandfather built his own house. It's still in existence in East St. John's. There's a coffee shop in it now. It was always a red building, and he built onto it afterwards to accommodate the shearmen, the fishermen. And my grandmother then would cook for these people in the summertime, and then get up 3 and 4 in the morning and go down to the wharf, to their rooms, to their little wharf, and go out, their first haul, and be back in around 5 or 6 o'clock, and do the cutting and heading of the fish, and putting it under salt, and going back out again for a second haul. Usually it was 2 hauls. There was a trap fishery in Newfoundland. I think it became very successful. My grandmother ran a little retail store in that house, in the bottom part of that house, looked after the fishermen in the summertime, raised a family, and he fished. And he had another set of fishing rooms in another community south of St. John's in Bay Bowls for a number of years. So here was a man who was highly unusual, being so successful. And he was recognized as that amongst his peers at the time. And the really interesting thing about him, which I never found out, my father never told me early on, was that he had the first motorized inshore fishing boat in the history of Newfoundland fishery. At the time, I knew about that. And when I was in politics, I knew about that. But what I didn't know until I was in politics and I was fighting oil and gas offshore Newfoundland, that the motor that propelled the propeller for the little boat, he bought from a guy in downtown St. John's who used it to drill oil in northern Newfoundland the year before. Now, that's quite something.
It is.
So I was so taken by that one of the first years I was premier, I did a Christmas card, a special Christmas card. I had somebody draw it or whatever of the area of Newfoundland down where Cabot Tower is, the Signal Hill is in St. John's, which a lot of people would know about. And at the top of Signal Hill is Cabot Tower, where Marconi sent the first wireless message overseas, right? Yes. 1904. 1901. I got somebody anyway. I got this thing drawn up of the rocks and the area of the battery of Signal Hill where my grandfather fished, and sent it out to all the people who lived in that area. Because I had to. Because it was just, I thought I owed the people there where my grandfather lived for me to recognize where I was from, on my Peckford side, where I was from. Because he was such a part of that little community, and such a successful fisherman. And then another time I went down on my own when I was streamer. I think it was a Sunday afternoon, and there were some old guys out sitting on their step outside their house, and I sat down next to them and started yarning to them. So why are you asking all these questions anyway? And Paul looked at me and he said, I ain't looked at anybody. He said, that's Brian. And he said, nah. Yeah, he said, that's Brian. Because that's what they all called me. Yes. And he said, Brian. I said, yes, sir. Yeah, he said, you're Joe Peckford's grandson. And I said, yes, sir. That's why I'm here. And he said, yeah, I know. He was quite the man. He said, hey, there. He said, and I said, yeah. I said, I know. I said, that's why I'm down. I just wanted to sit down. I want to just feel the soil here and talk to someone like yourselves who remembered my grandfather. Yeah. And so they start telling me stories about him. So, and then my father, my grandmother, Peckford, who ran the little store, you're not going that boat. That's not what you're going to be when you grow up. That's too hard to work. That's too uncertain. That's too crazy. And so for 10 years of his life on Saturdays, when all the kids are out playing and kicking a soccer ball or whatever, he was in taking piano lessons with a nearby person who gave piano lessons, because he did show some ability to sing and stuff like that. And so he became a really good pianist, my dad did. But that's what he did for 10 years, from the time he was like 10 till he was 17. Somewhere like there. He was every Saturday afternoon, he was doing his piano lessons. But my dad, in his own way, was, a very successful and independent person. I think the other thing about them was their independence. That struck a chord with me. I really valued that. I valued anytime my dad or anybody did anything as an independent person, took the initiative to do something on their own, without their neighbors or anybody. Just do it because I am John, or I am Joe, or I am Bill, or I am Mary, and I want to do this. I want to do this. I think this is something I should do. That always, and I remember my grandmother, she lived well beyond my grandfather. She lived till she was 94, 95. And the other part of it was, as I mentioned a lot of my speeches, I always mention books. And I don't know if I ever saw my grandmother Peckford without a book in her lap. If she was sitting down, she had a book in her lap. And that also was very, I like that too. And so her daughter, my aunt, who became a nurse and went to Boston, became very involved in nursing and healthcare in the Boston area, would always send me books, because she knew I used to talk with her mother and my grandmother and say, oh, my grandma always had books. And my aunt was just like that. She would click on to that. And she never forgot that, so she always sent me books. And the thing about my aunt, connecting to my grandfather and my father, was when got her RN in Newfoundland in St. John's, and then saw an opportunity to expand and get further education, which she did in Boston. And then got attached to a hospital there, and later became a nurse to terminally ill, wealthy New England nurse, who would spend a half year or more with these people seconded from the hospital. And we would get postcards from her from all over the world, where they were doing whatever it was they wanted to do before they died, from Tibet or from India or from. So you would get postcards from me when I was growing up. And my aunt, who I did get to know fairly well, she was all there to help people if they were helping themselves. She never helped anybody who didn't help themselves. So when I started to go to university, she made sure that all the tickets to the Arts and Culture Center would be brought in, music and culture, and I had cultural acts the year, all free. For the 4 years I went through university, that was just automatic, stuff like that. And when I worked on the Labrador coast as a social worker while I was going to university, I would get these big packages from her. And the family, when growing up, we always got packages. And she never forgot anybody's birthday. Any of her nephews or the people. Nobody's. So, but she was an extremely independent person. And I remember asking her, I got to tell you this story, whether you want to carry it or not. When I went to university, she came home every year, and she had told her mother, my grandmother, when you get too old to look after yourself, I will look after you until you die. And when my grandmother got too old to look after her, I was staying with my other aunt, who had a family. My aunt came home from Boston and nursed her until she died.
Very nice.
Quite something. Well, my aunt always liked Chinese food. And one night she'd come home when I was at university. She'd always we'd get together and she'd take me out to this restaurant in some corner of the restaurant because she wanted to talk. She loved to talk, like yours truly. I asked her, I got up enough nerve to ask her. I said, are you involved in anything else in Boston? He said, just nursing and whatever. Are you involved in other things? Oh, yes, she said. Of course I am. And I said, what else are you involved in? And she said, I'm a member of the Republican Party. And I said, I contribute to it all the time. And she said, I contribute to such an extent that I'm invited to all their big do's here in Massachusetts and New England. I can go visit and meet with the governors or the senators or the congressmen. She said, that's what I do. That's part of what I do. And I've got these friends, blah, blah. So I don't know if it was in that meeting or another meeting. I got to courage it up to ask her the question, why are you a Republican?
And what was her answer?
And her answer was, because I like people who believe in work. I will contribute to people who like to work. And I'm not looking to the government for everything.